I should start with my declarations. I'm affiliated to Rossdale's Equine Hospital, but more relevant to today, Equine Veterinary Journal. And I should point out that this session is sponsored by Wiley, as we've just heard, and Wiley is, of course, EVJ Limited's publishing partner. So I'm going to start this by talking a bit about animal ethics, or ethical animal research, I should say. The International Association of Veterinary Editors produced a consensus guideline in 2010. There were various key principles that they put into developing these author guidelines. You can read them as well as I can, but just to highlight the points, they emphasize that we should have a clear editorial policy applying both to experimental animals and client-owned animals, and that needed to appear prominently in the journal. It was also important that the guidelines apply to all animals, and of course there are journal-specific requirements, but policies should make it very clear that manuscripts in which there is failure to meet ethical concerns regarding animal welfare should result in rejection. And journals should require authors to make a declaration of compliance. Now, the subject for this afternoon is clinical research, so I've just put in one slide about ethical use of experimental animals. That's a whole big subject that we could have a whole day on, but obviously it's covered by different regulations in different countries. Here in the UK is ASPA, but we know that that's a different subject. I would just draw your attention to the ARRIVE guidelines. EVJ has recently endorsed these, and these are a set of reporting guidelines in which the point is made that if we reported experimental research better, we might be able to minimize the use of unnecessary studies. So, ethical use of client-owned animals as research is the main thing I think that's pertinent this afternoon. And I've put some considerable thought into the order in which I was going to put in these four principles. I know that I've been guilty in the past in some of the material that I've produced of somewhat conflating issues around owner-informed consent and also formal ethical review. And when I look at other documents, and some that I'll talk about later that have come out of the RCVS, these two processes have tended to become jumbled up. And I think it's quite important to separate them. So formal reporting, having a badge of honor, a code number that you've got from an ethical committee is important, perhaps, because it may be fitting with institutional guidelines or national guidelines. Professional bodies may require you this, but I would put that down at the bottom of the list. And far more important for clinical or for research on client-owned animals is the concept of owner-informed consent. That is the number one as I see it. I'm going to talk about both of these topics and expand on them in the later slides, but number two and number three are almost givens. We expect to have the highest standard of veterinary care, and we would expect people to comply with our national regulations. Why do we need owner-informed consent? Well, it's basically about empowering the owner. The owner doesn't really need to have a reason for not liking research. They can just be bonkers, and that's fine. We can't do anything about that. Owners make their own decisions. We as veterinarians, we as researchers can't make those decisions for them. So we have to allow the owner the right to express their own individual views and opinions, rights, if you like, regarding the management of their animals and the specific research that someone may be considering, and research in general. We have to maintain the owner's right to privacy. And I think something we quite often forget is that if you do poor quality research, that is unethical because you're wasting someone's time. You're perhaps giving them a bad experience with research, might put them off doing it again, but at the very least you might just simply you might be wasting your own time, and that's fine. It's your time, you can waste it. But if you're wasting someone else's time, then that's more of a problem. An important thing that I think a lot of authors confuse is it's pretty much standard practice in clinical practice nowadays to get consent, and that may be verbal and it may be written. But just because someone gives you consent to do diagnostic investigations and treatment, that is not consent for you to include their animal in a research study. So that's quite important. I've put, does it always have to be written as a question mark? You'll tend to see that documentation tends to favour written consent. I'm not sure that that is always the case. So what are the key elements of valid informed consent? The researcher has to disclose sufficient information in an understandable language that the owner can understand what the research is about. They have to have capacity, so the owner has to be an appropriate age and so forth in order to give the consent. And the owner has to feel no pressure, so it's got to be voluntary, and they must know that if they choose not to play along with your research study, that their animals are still going to get exactly the same care. Now, I'm going to divert a little bit into talking about the UK, and that's because we're in the UK, and I apologise to those of you who find that in some way upsetting, but the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons is the UK governing body for veterinarians in practice, and, well, all veterinarians. They have produced a very helpful report, which is guidance and advice. It is not, if you like, regulation, but I would urge you to read that report. And most of the report is about the need for ethical review, and it is, having read it again last night, brief skim read it, they are guilty of doing exactly the same thing as I do, which they tend to conflate ethical review and owner-informed consent together. So that's just a trap that I would warn you about. But there are definite benefits of ethical review, and I think the main thing is it helps you plan better. So poorly designed research is unethical. It's helpful to have independent scrutiny of your plans because it helps you to work out where you might be weak on monitoring, helps you to anticipate what complications might arise. And it will reduce the risk of unanticipated problems. It helps you sometimes to take a step back and think, actually, the question I'm asking is not sufficiently well thought through, so it'll help you to finesse that question, and it'll ensure your study has the greatest likelihood of answering the question you ask. So you shouldn't be thinking about ethical review as a hurdle over which you have to scramble. It's a beneficial process. So even if you don't have a ethical review institutional committee to go to, it is still nevertheless helpful to get others to look at your study and see what you're doing. Accessing ethical review is easy in an institute, perhaps not quite so in practice. So the RCVS have come up with various suggestions for how that might be achieved. I guess I'd advise you against an ad hoc ethical review committee and encourage people who want to do practice-based research, which is after all what I am, or what I do, not so much anymore, but to collaborate with others in institutes and make use of the collaborative approach. But there possibly in the long term, the RCVS may do this, and obviously those in other countries, the advice would be similar, to collaborate with others. But even if it's not a formal process, try to get somebody to have a look at what you're doing. There is an issue with retrospective studies, which is, nobody has a time machine. We can't go backwards. And 25% of the papers that are published in Equine Veterinary Journal are descriptive retrospectives. That is our bread and butter. And I know that if you haven't got consent for a case that came back in 2002 or whatever, you're never going to get that. I know that. But I think maybe we should be looking to the future and thinking about whether perhaps in future we need to start to put this in place. So currently you'll see in EVJ statements like this, explicit owner consent was not stated. I just wanted to put it out there, really, that perhaps an opt-out clause in a standard hospital admission form might be good. And what do I mean by that? Well, the concept of having an opt-out it really has come to the attention in the UK through initiatives within the National Health Service, which is that it's been suggested that all the data that's collected in relation to human health could be pooled and made available as a research resource. And that's obviously a big project. And what the UK government was proposing is that if individuals had reservations about that, the way to get out of it would be to opt out. So the assumption would be everybody would be in and you have to actively get yourself out. So that's kind of an interesting idea. And I thought that might work in veterinary medicine. Typically, when this came out in the press in the UK, there has been a largely negative response. So it's something just to sort of watch out for. But I know that it's quite common in some standard hospital consent forms and also laboratory submission forms. Laboratories frequently archive samples, which are a useful resource for research. So possibly having a assumption that you're allowed to do that with an active opt-out might be a way forward. A word or two about questionnaires. If you're At the moment, the RCVS is again recommending that we should have them looked at by an ethical committee, and that's something that I would endorse, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's absolutely essential. This is a situation where this issue of written consent, if your questionnaire is delivered by telephone, it's quite difficult then to get written consent. And I'm conscious that I'm talking all about EVJ, this is what EVJ does, this is what EVJ does. It's very important that you appreciate that not every journal has the same attitudes, and it's always set out in the author guidelines. So go to the author guidelines of your target journal. But certainly the collective view of the editorial board in the EVJ is that it's probably okay if it's a telephone questionnaire to have verbal consent. We would also go along with the idea that if someone actively completes an online questionnaire, we can take that to that the person wanted to complete it. That may have to change. Now, here's one of the problems, moving on to sort of post-mortem. There have been major scandals in the UK in relation to the storage of organs, and that these came out, I guess, about 15 years ago now, but that certainly made people, I was in the British universities at the time, it made people sit up and think, oh gosh, we're doing that with animals too. So the use of tissues for collective or clinical research, it is advisable that when you're collecting tissues and storing them and so forth, that the owners are aware that tissues may be retained for, I think the phrase is research and educational purposes and so forth. So that is certainly something that I would expect to see possibly highlighted as a process that someone had included in their study. Now, there are some equine-specific considerations for this. We all know that some horses land up in abattoirs. The attitude that I would take to that is that if someone takes a horse at an abattoir, actually at the moment of death, the abattoir owner is the owner of that horse. It may be until shortly thereafter somebody else was the owner, but right when it's going into the food chain, I don't think we need to be asking individual previous owners about that, because the abattoir permission is sufficient. And, you know, again, I would point out that if perhaps we can have more discussion about this, because that's exactly why we're following up with quite a lengthy discussion session. But that's my view. And similarly, in the US, there are a lot of donation programs that have tax benefits. I'm assured by various colleagues who I've asked that those horses going into donation programs always have permission for research. They don't necessarily know which study they're going into, but they are being signed over for research purposes. Another equine-specific consideration, racing and sporting authorities, not so much in the UK, but certainly in other parts of the world, the racing jurisdictions have requirements for post-mortem, for example. And if you take your horse to one of those tracks, you have to comply with that. So I would say that it is appropriate for us to get consent from the racing authority. We don't have to track down every individual racehorse owner. Final point about equine-specific considerations. Breeding of horses is obviously a commercial activity. Pedigrees are published. It's not that hard to work out what the relationships of one horse to another might be. This is, of course, Impressive, who is a good example of a horse that has a genetic trait, but nevertheless he has some benefits that go along with that. I'm told this is an admirable-looking quarter horse. So I think genetics research is something we have to be very careful about. And I would like to see that all research involving genotyping has consent of the person that owns that horse. That may not necessarily be to the satisfaction of the breeder, but I think that's something that we have to be conscious of. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to competing interests. As we know, authors are required to disclose competing interests, and these are the words that appear in EVJ's author guidelines. Other journals will have something very similar, and in most journals those competing interests will be declared alongside the paper. Just a few pitfalls, really. It's common mistakes that people make is they declare their own. The first author tends to be the one filling in the form, or the corresponding author will often make his own declarations and forget that he's got a whole bunch of co-authors. So when we ask for the author's competing interests, we mean all the authors, not just the one that's filling in the form. I'd point out that there is absolutely nothing to gain from hiding them. Papers don't get rejected because you declare that you are an employee of the company that manufactures the drug that is under investigation. There's everything to lose, though, because if we subsequently find out that there are undeclared competing interests, that is all that an editor needs to just dump you. And the real point is that this is about transparency. It's not editors and reviewers that's judging this. You just declare your competing interests and allow the reader to form their own opinions as to whether that constitutes bias or not. So it's about transparency. In human medicine, there are standard competing interest forms that are quite complex, and some of them get sort of archived. This is the form that you can download from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. We haven't yet got there in veterinary medicine, but that's something that perhaps journals should be working together to reach some more consistency. Next topic that I wanted to briefly turn my attention to in the last 3.26 seconds, authorship. It's a difficult one to really pin down who is an author and who's not. Again, that same group, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, has defined some criteria which many journals, including my own, follow. So an author should have made a substantial contribution to the study, a substantial intellectual contribution. They should also be involved in drafting the article, and they should give final approval of the version to be published. And some journals include the details of authorship and what each person's contributed, others don't. Essentially what they're doing is guaranteeing or taking responsibility or accountability for either the whole work or some aspect of it. It's perhaps easier for me to tell you what's not authorship. So technical support, someone who's just given some financial support without intellectual input, someone who's helped you with the writing or the translation, somebody who's a friend, like maybe you and your residence mate need 2 papers between you, so you swap them around. Very bad, don't do that. And similarly, the one that probably involves the most controversy is clinicians who allow you to use their cases. I'll let you use my cases in your study if you let me be on your paper. Just being the clinician, particularly in large studies, isn't really enough anymore. But obviously at that level, you've probably got institutional policies that you might want to follow. The final point I wanted to make about was just discussing duplicate and redundant publication and sharing work. Duplicate and redundant publication means publishing the same material more than once. And that's different from plagiarism, which is publishing somebody else's work. It is a serious misdemeanor. It wastes resources, it corrupts the literature, it contaminates systematic reviews. And out, just publishing the exact same data set is clearly duplicate publication. What's slightly more difficult to define is what's known as salami publication, where you do a study and then you chop it up into the smallest possible bits to get multiple papers. And that's actually quite difficult for an editor to spot, because usually you get the first paper, and that's fine, and then that one goes through and gets accepted, and then the little ones start to follow, and you're kind of tearing your hair out because you kind of wish, if only we hadn't have published that one, we could have had a really good paper. So I'd encourage you to aim for quality, not quantity. Publication bias and failure to publish, I'm going to skip that because that's something that's very important, but very well recognized. Just wanted to make one final point in my last 30 seconds. As far as copyright's concerned, you can't have your cake and eat it. If you give your ownership, if you want to keep ownership of your work, then don't give it away. So when you submit your work to a journal, unless you're paying for the gold open access publication, you will be expected to sign a copyright transfer agreement. And that means that you've given it away. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Marr. Okay. Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Rob Chrstley, who's going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, pitfalls in statistical analysis.
Not sure how to use that. Yeah, I got the short straw. Can
we have the first slide?
Do I do that? No. Here we are.
No,
Thank you
there
very
we
much. Okay, so statistics, everyone's favourite. You might just notice that I've changed the title of this slide ever so slightly, and I've called it Common Pitfalls in Statistics, and that's deliberate because I think one of the common pitfalls in statistics is to only focus on this sort of thing that we might consider to be the analysis and not to see statistics as something that runs through the entire process of research. And I'll try and communicate that with some examples as we go through. Okay, my declarations. I am the statistical editor for EVJ, and obviously, as Celia said, this is sponsored by Wiley. I was supposed to put my funding up there. I don't think there's any conflicts there. But I also just add a little acknowledgement at this point to the members of the Study Design and Data Analysis Board of EVJ. So this is a collection of people who provide advice and so on those very issues. And so as part of the preparation for this, I sort of polled that group to find out what they think are the big pitfalls for statistical work. And I hope I'm reflecting accurately a lot of their opinions. But even within this group, there's some sort of disagreement on some minor and perhaps some major issues, which highlights one of the pitfalls with statistics is people don't necessarily agree. Okay, so I guess one of the aims of this is to try and get away from what I think are the three most common responses to the idea of doing some statistics or trying to understand statistics, which is either just running away from it, sticking your head in the sand, or just falling apart screaming. Taking a sensible, stepwise, rational approach can solve a lot of problems. But, of course, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and as vets, we're not necessarily trained to be statisticians. And even when we were trained to be statisticians, we may not be doing so well. I mean, I have to be honest and admit that I did fail my statistics undergraduate exam. But there you go. I wasn't alone. So it is a difficult topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through, I guess, what I've called my 5 top pitfalls, but really these are just collections or areas where there's multiple pitfalls possible. And so these run right through the whole process of research, as I said. So from the very beginning of thinking about what you're going to do, setting your question, designing a study, doing the statistics. I'll talk a little bit about p-values because they bother some people. And even going through to interpreting your results and presenting the results is, I think, part of the whole statistical process. And everything can come unstuck at that point. I think one of the key problems with a lot of statistical analysis is that people don't spend enough time, or certainly don't do it in the right way, at the beginning of the study, coming up with the key questions that they're really interested in their study addressing. Okay, so they've got this idea, they're interested in a particular disease, say, they know they've got access to data, let's go and collect some data and we'll see what we can do with it. It's kind of the wrong way round. It's much better to spend some time thinking, what is it that I'm really interested in? If I can do one thing here, what would it be? And you might be able to add a couple more things in, but that's about the limit of it. Ideally, those questions can be formulated as hypotheses. Okay, not many of us, and certainly I don't think in hypotheses, but it's useful to do that because the statistical test that you're going to use is thinking about these things in hypotheses. Okay, it is testing an hypothesis. Okay. One of the things we often do I think in equine research and veterinary research in general is to think, well, we don't actually know much about this topic, so I'm going to what I want to do is know something. I want to learn something about this particular topic. So I don't have any particular ideas or particular questions. I just want to know as much as I can. So in that case, you're sort of doing an exploratory study. It's not a focus study as I'm suggesting here. And I think that's okay, but you need to recognize it for what it is. Okay, you're doing multiple testing, you're kind of data dredging, and so you need to interpret your study in exactly the light that you've kind of framed it as exploratory. Okay, you're not perhaps trying to solve particular issues, but you're looking at what might be interesting issues that you can pursue or somebody can pursue in the future. Okay, so I would say set up some clear hypotheses and avoid multiple testing if you can. Poor study design. The key thing here is that it's no good just having a rubbish study and saying, well, the statistician will sort it out. Okay? The results can be no better than the study that you've conducted, not necessarily the one you designed, because the one you actually end up doing is not always the one you designed. Okay? And this is what I mean, and I said earlier, this statistics, this whole science of statistics runs right through. It's as much about designing the study as about the analysis of the study. And the things I try to recommend that people do, and I try to do myself, is actually understand how I'm going to analyse a study before I start doing it. The nice thing about doing that is that actually then you're pretty confident it can be analysed. Okay? It helps you measure the things you need to measure in the right way. And in terms of things like sample size calculations, it means you can do those. And it helps you think about these other things about study design that can be important as well. The problem with study design, or poor study designs, is you can end up building something that's beautiful to look at, but actually impossible. Okay? So here we've got people going round and round. And you know, it's not uncommon for people to come to me to say, well, I'd really like to analyse this study to show something or other, and ultimately, after lots of tears, we work out that it's not really possible to do what they've set out to do. And it comes back to ideas of whether that's ethical or not in the first place. Sample size is one of the key design issues. And I flag it up because it does pop up as an editorial issue within certainly EVJ, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. The key issue clearly is that if you've got too small a study, you may well fail to detect clinically important effects. Of course, the opposite of that is, you know, doing a massive study that's too, you know, bigger than it needs to be, waste time, money, effort, and again, probably isn't ethical either. So the aim of the sample size calculation is to give you a guide, some idea of the number of observations that you may need to include in your study. Okay? But with that goes lots of assumptions, guesses as well. So I think it's important that you try to do these beforehand, and to do that you need to know the question you're going to ask, and you need to know the statistical approaches you're going to use, and to aim for that sort of number. But you also need to discuss some of the assumptions that you've made in calculating that particular value. What quite often happens is that people come along afterwards and they think, and that maybe they've read the EVJ guidelines at that point, they realise that you're supposed to have a sample size calculation, so they do it then. And the problem with that is actually, it's actually of fairly limited use. First of all, it hasn't helped you design the study, which is the aim of the sample size calculation. But by using the values that you've calculated from within the study, the whole thing kind of just implodes on itself, and it's actually not that useful. It doesn't provide that much information. So you may need to think about, if you haven't done your sample size calculations, it's not necessarily, at least from our point of view, I think, a catastrophe, although it's not great, but you may need to think about ways of explaining some of the limits of the study. Okay, so I guess the next point I want to make, or one of the pitfalls you can fall into, is this idea that statistics will, I'll do the study, I know what I'm interested in, and statistics will somehow grind through this data and make sense of it for me. And I think that's wrong. Okay. Statisticians are very good at doing statistics, perhaps, but this sort of work really should be a partnership between somebody who knows about statistics and somebody who knows about the clinical problem. Okay. So this is what I sort of mean by this idea of just do it, but don't just do it. Don't just do statistics. Okay. That's not an excuse for not thinking. It's not some sort of grinding machine that you can sort of turn sausages out or whatever. Okay. You really need to think about what you're doing. I actually think the first thing you should be asking yourself is, actually, is statistical analysis really warranted in this case? You know, you've got two cases of something. You're not going to be doing statistics. Okay, so don't try and force these things just because you think it should be appropriate. If you think it is appropriate, then what are the most appropriate approaches? And the key thing here is that actually you have a good idea, or you have the knowledge to enable you or to work out what are the appropriate methods. And what I'd recommend is that you try not to be constrained by your own knowledge. Now that sounds a little bit tricky because it's hard to plan to do something you've never heard of. But what I'm suggesting is you recognise the limitations of what you know. You also don't just do something that you saw somebody had published 5 years ago. Well, they did that test, so I'll do that test. Without really knowing why they've done it, if it was appropriate, and if it's also appropriate for you. And of course, there's a lot of statistical programs out there. Some of them are free on the web. But don't be constrained by what they do as well, because most of them don't do everything that you might need to do. Okay, so it may be that you need help, or you need to learn a new statistical program or something like that. My advice is get help, which we can discuss how easy or not that is. Another problem with just doing it, leaping straight into these sorts of things, again, because they're available through fairly accessible software, is that you can fail to recognize and take account of and think about some of the key assumptions that underline and underpin these methods. Okay? So most people, I think, recognize that things like a t-test kind of like to have normally distributed data. A lot of people don't realize that the variance should be the same in your two groups as well. And actually, it's the variance one that probably matters more, and so on. And all these other tests have assumptions. Now, the problem is that it's actually probably quite rare to find perfectly normally distributed data, for example. So, but how much variation is enough, or how much non-normality is a problem? And so there's a lot of judgment that comes into this as well. So again, having someone with experience that you can turn to does help a little bit. But really, you should be thinking about these assumptions, so you should need to know about them. You should test them, test your data against these assumptions, and at least provide evidence that you've done that within the paper, and you may want to discuss any ramifications as well. Again, I think something that is very common in equine research in particular is this failure to account for what we might call non-independent observations, because most statistical tests assume that the data are independent. And what I mean by that is that if, for example, we're studying some horses, then if we picked any two horses from our study at random, they should be no more similar to each other than any other two, at least by chance. They shouldn't be any more similar to any other pair of horses just by chance. But of course, horses often cluster within yards, for example, and you might imagine situations where horses from the same yard are more similar to each other than horses that come from different yards, just because of the way they're kept, the feed, the environment, their management, their exercise regimes, or whatever it happens to be. Often yards might be clustered within regions which might affect things. Cases tend to be clustered within veterinary surgeons, and of course what happens to that horse, the way it's treated, its outcome, etc., may actually be down to something to do with the veterinary surgeon, so they might be more similar to each other. And of course, you might measure the same horse multiple times, either over time in a repeated measure, or by taking samples from multiple joints all at one time. Okay? And again, those samples are not independent. They're from within a horse. Now, the problem with ignoring this is that the most likely mistake you're going to make is actually finding something statistically significant when it's not. Okay, so you're going to get false positives in your data. But accounting for it may not be easy, depends on what you've done. So again, if you're starting to get into these sorts of areas, you probably do need to find someone who can assist you through that process. And if you're doing a lot, you probably need to learn about it. Okay. So modelling, statistical modelling, is something that appears more and more in the veterinary press, and certainly in EVJ as well, veterinary journals. And it's part of the thing is that, of course, people are reading more about it. It's very easy now to do it using statistical software, but it's also very easy to do poorly. And again, there's a science behind this whole process. So I think if you're going to use these methods, and I think very often they are appropriate for the sorts of data that we're collecting that is appearing in clinical research, there needs to be an investment in understanding the process or in working with somebody who does. Now, my approach to statistical modelling, I mean, some people say that statistical modelling is as much an art as a science, and to some extent that's true. But just like there's bad art, there's bad statistical modelling. So my approach is that really, again, the statistical model is not just trying to test everything for you. It's not sort of a panacea to your problems. What it should be doing is trying to test the data that you've collected against some sort of model of the world, or the way the world works, that you've constructed. Okay, so you think, well, I think the world works this way. I think the causes of this disease are this, or if I do such and such, animals are going to get better faster or something. I've collected this data. Does this data agree with or support my view of the world? And that's what the model's trying to do. Okay? So you can find evidence to try and test that model of the world that you have. Another thing that I think is often overlooked is that really a model should be designed to test a particular question. Okay? So I'm interested in a particular risk factor for this condition, so that's my risk factor of interest. Obviously the condition then is the outcome that I'm interested in, and now I need to think about what are all the other things that might influence that relationship, and I'll test that in a statistical model. If my interest changes to some other risk factor, it's possible, it's not necessarily always the case, but it's possible that I will need to slightly change the model. Okay? But very often in the literature we see a single model that is interpreted for everything that's in it, and I don't think that's appropriate, or may not be appropriate. And again, don't just leave this to somebody to do blindly, or to a machine to do blindly. Again, it requires clinical input. Okay? It requires you as experts on the topic to have input into it. And that's why also I don't think you can just email off a spreadsheet to a statistician and ask for the results back. That person needs to actually understand what's going on. Okay, p-values. I've kind of raised this for several reasons. There's several problems, I think, with p-values. One is that I think a lot of people don't kind of know what they are, although they get thrown around a lot. And even when they do know what they are, they don't kind of think about them in the appropriate way. I know I tend not to because it's complicated. So there's a little explanation there. It may or may not make sense to you. Hopefully it makes some sense. But basically the p-value is assuming that the null hypothesis is true. How strange is the data that I've collected? Okay, so if there really is no difference between these two groups, what's the chances I'd have seen what I've just seen? And if that's sufficiently odd, if it's sufficiently surprising, then we tend to say, well, maybe the null hypothesis isn't true, and we'll reject it. Okay, that's what it's all about. But this idea of 0.05, which I think people are moving away from this as being some sort of magical number, because really it's not. I don't know if it's true, but the anecdote behind this is that a guy called Ronald Fisher, who came up with a lot of this, was presenting this work, and somebody said, well, how rare is rare enough? How odd is odd enough? And he said, I know, about 1 in 20, and it stuck. But actually, if you think about it, it doesn't tell us very much. You very often read in abstracts, group X was different to group Y, p less than 0.05 or something. Well, I've learned very little there. I want to know how big is, how much difference is there? I need to know the direction, which group was bigger. And I want to know how precise those estimates are. Okay, so really we need to be thinking about presenting this information. I think I think a lot of people are getting away from this idea that you can write when something's not statistically significant using this magic value of 0.05, that you can say, well, they're the same. There was no effect of X or Y. So people replace it with, well, they weren't statistically different, and then the inference behind all of that is that really they are the same. But they're not, okay? Your statistical tests, at least your standard statistical tests, are not telling you whether things are the same. If you want to say whether things are the same, you need to do other methods. And so you need to frame your question so that you're addressing them correctly in the first place. Okay, and the final point, have we gone backwards? I think I've gone backwards. I am going backwards, beg your pardon. Okay, again, something I get people coming to me to ask is, well, okay, I've collected my data, how do I get a significant result? And that's just kind of driving bad practice, I think. You don't want to be trying to force an answer that you think you want. The idea of statistics is to kind of help you understand the data, not to get to where you thought you were going. Okay, and trying to find something significant drives people to just dredging the data, trying to look somewhere in this spreadsheet. There must be something statistically significant. Or do subgroup analyses. Well, what happens if we just look at the males, or the males over 5 years of age, and the ones that came from that particular part of the country? And eventually you'll find something, okay, and then you can publish your paper. My sort of maxim is, if the study was worth doing and you've done it well, even if you can't find something statistically significant, try to publish it, okay? And this comes back to what Celia was saying about publication bias as being a bit of a problem. Similarly, if it's not worth doing or you've not done it well, just bin it. Forget about it. Okay, I'm going to have to move on. interpretation of results, I don't think statistics really lie, but they can be misused, or perhaps you could say people lie. And as authors, we kind of have a vested interest. We want to get things published, we want to progress our careers, we want to be respected, we want to be finding this sort of stuff. But really, you should be letting the data, as much as possible, speak for itself, not trying to impose your wishes onto it. Again, just to finish up, some poor presentation of the results. Don't just focus on the statistically significant results. Your presentation of the results should focus on the question that you're interested in the first place. Don't just use p-values, use standard errors and standard deviations as appropriate for what you're trying to convey. And again, coming back to the International Committee of Medical Journals and Editors, another thing is that you need to let your readers and the editor and the reviewers know what you've done. Okay, so you need to describe it in sufficient detail that they really can understand what you've done in your statistical analysis and why you've done it. Perhaps these days, that might be part of an online supplement if there's a lot of information that's required. Okay, so I've sort of run through these things, right from the beginning of the study through to hopefully the publication phase, and try to outline at least some of what I see as the key problems in that area. And I will leave you with a useful reference. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Dr. Celia Marr again to speak about the pitfalls in writing your paper.
So this one is, this one is even more ridiculous to attempt to do this in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to do my usual solution, which is I'll talk really, really fast. Can I have my slides, please? Oh. We've used 6 seconds already. So, common pitfalls in writing your paper. Here's the declarations. I think probably this is the most useful slide, actually. There are lots of excellent resources out there. These are 2 fairly standard books. This one in particular, I find particularly easy to read and sets out all the points in a really concise manner. But they're both really good. I also put this one in too, because I think people could just benefit a little bit from writing well. And this is actually a guide that came free with The Economist, which I don't normally read, by the way, but it comes with glowing recommendations from Bill Bryson, so that's good enough for me. But many of the Wiley journals have a link on them to this free online guide, which was written by Mair Christopher and Maureen Long, who are both very, very experienced in this arena, and it's extremely easy to read. It's about 20 to 30 pages, so I would encourage you you'll find it on all the Wiley home pages, but usually under the special features. So that's a free online guide. That's a really good place to start if this is a new world to you. Also wanted to sort of grapple with this thorny issue. The veterinary journals tend to be international in flavour. We certainly would, although obviously we're very closely linked to BEVA, owned by them in fact, we would like to think of ourselves as being an international journal, and that's true of all the main large clinical journals. And I think people who are not native English speakers kind of think that all their great work is rejected just because it's poor English. So I thought I'd address this question. Are good quality studies rejected because of poor English? Well, the answer is the responsibility is all yours. You have to get your work into a format that English that can be understood. Because if you don't write it in a manner that people can understand, then we can't really see whether it's good or not. So it's your job. And the days in which journals were able to provide lots of help and support to authors, I think, is long since gone. Certainly it's not appropriate to expect reviewers to help you. Reviewers generally have many calls on their time, including many of them obviously mentor others. So I would encourage reviewers to stay at home and mentor their own students and not worry too much about others. So it is the responsibility of the authors. I think it's rare to see a good study badly written, but the caveat to that is that if we can't understand it, then we would tend not to send it out for review. And I think what's also perhaps harder to kind of pin down but we will be looking at work weighing up how much effort is it going to take to get this back and forth? How much can we expect to send it back to the reviewers again and again to sort it out? And we're going to balance that against how useful or interesting we think the study is going to be for our readers. And so if that balance between, yeah, we'll help people a little bit, but if it starts to be, we're going to have to help this person a lot, we're going to chuck it, you know, that it may not stack up in your favour. So what to do about this? Do get help from someone who's experienced in written English. Written is the key, but they also need to understand your own language. And I think they also probably need to understand scientific writing. So do consider using a professional language service. They're out there on the internet. Certainly the Wiley journals have links to that. But I think you have to resist the temptation of thinking, oh yeah, there's a guy over in the small animal hospital. He's from the UK. He'll help me. Relying on colleagues probably isn't the answer. If one of your friends, family members, or neighbours happens to be good at English, they may not necessarily be good at scientific writing. And one of my key bugbears is ask a native English speaker. Let me just play for you a native English speaker.
Hello, Caledonia Bank Customer Service Department. You're speaking to Melissa. How can I help you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I appear to have phoned the wrong bank.
Sorry, sir. This is the Caledonia Bank. What bank were you looking for?
The Caledonia Bank.
I don't understand.
The Caledonia Bank, run for Scotland by Scotland. Is that nae fit your advert says?
That is our slogan, yes.
Well, forgive my confusion, but you dinna sound Scottish to me.
I'm sorry, sir, but you cannot tell my nationality from my voice.
My brother thinks I sound very posh these days, but that's how they speak where I come from. So a native English speaker, it can be many, many things. So please don't tell us that you had it looked at by a native English speaker. I think immediately of my father, who could actually talk for several minutes using the local dialect that I've never been able to understand. So moving now on to more general points, it's important that you use language concisely. Use short, simple sentences. Avoid any extra words. We don't want extra words. We want to pack as many papers as we possibly can into the journal. So any kind of adjective, adverbs, that sort of stuff, we're not interested. And try to use the minimum number of words. So the sort of phrase, these are just examples, but this is a common one. To the author's knowledge, there are no peer-reviewed studies in the literature in which, what you mean is there are no reports. Or here's another one, as well as, together words. What you mean is and. So literally look at every single word and see if you can't just simplify it, make it easy. Be aware, of course, that many of our readers are not necessarily native English speakers. So it's short, simple sentences. This is not a poem, it's not a piece of literature. It is scientific writing, so try and keep it simple. Take care with abbreviations, because abbreviations reduce the number of letters on the page, but you know they do make things very clunky. So you may get bored of typing metacarpal phalangeal joint. That one actually isn't a good example because there's sort of standard abbreviations. Try to use the standard abbreviations that people will be familiar with. Don't start making up a whole bunch your own. And I say that as someone who is involved in writing papers with echocardiography, where we obviously always make up our own abbreviations, but you know, do be careful about that. Check the author guidelines. Are you trying to squeeze your paper into something that is not right for the journal? And conversely, is the journal right for the message that you're trying to get across? Look also at the different types of manuscripts that are available in that journal and look carefully. Do they want you to use reporting guidelines and checklists? All the sort of details of format, they'll all be set out there. And please do remember, we change the author guidelines as we go along. When I first started, I think we changed them probably about 3 times in the first 6 months. So now, certainly in EVJ, we change them every January and we keep adding little things, taking little things out. So don't think, oh yeah, I've published loads with them before. They do get changed. And the details of submission and so forth will also be set out there. I'm going to go on now really and focus on the standard sort of original research paper, which is sometimes talked about as the IMRAD. So your goal with this, and Rob's alluded to this already, is the basic goal is to describe the study in sufficient detail and clarity that a reasonably competent worker could repeat it and expect to get the same results. And you can translate that into introduction. What do you want to do and why? What's the background and hypothesis? That is the introduction. Materials and methods. Exactly how did I do it? How did I design the study? How did I analyze it? What did I find? That's the results. And then finally the discussion. What did it mean? How does that fit with what's already known? Etc., etc. So we work through in this standard format. When it comes to the introduction, think about who your target reader is. They may actually know quite a lot about equine medicine or equine surgery, whereas you may be new to the field. So assume a reasonable level of competence. A good example of this that I always quote is, remember reading a paper which was about antimicrobials, different doses of antimicrobial use in foals of different ages. So as the foal gets older, you need to modify the dose. And the paper starts with a discussion of failure of passive transfer, which this author obviously thought we might need some clues as to why we might use antimicrobials. Come on, you know, a bunch of equine clinicians, cut to the chase. We know why we use antimicrobials. What we want to know is, why did you do this particular study? How does it build on existing knowledge? So you certainly need to refer to the literature, but you don't need to put in statements like lameness is common in horses, brackets 1 to 10 references. You know, assume that the people know that sort of thing. You outline the hypothesis that you're testing, give a brief introduction to your general approach. This one, in lots of science journals, they conclude their introduction with some sort of synopsis of their overall conclusions. I have to say, in EVJ, we don't tend to do that. We tend to stop at outlining what the general approach in question is. But certainly, it's not the sort of thing I would typically take out, but you know, it does vary from journal to journal. In the methods, just again, highlighting a list of key points. What you're doing in the methods is talking about who, what, why, and where. How did you do it? It would be usual to put in some information about ethical approval and owner consent. If you're using unusual or novel methods, you certainly need to describe them in a great deal of detail. But you can use references to just support standard or previous published methods. Rob has talked about the statistical approach, and I just wanted to highlight the advantages of having a priori power study for all the reasons Rob's gone through. And I think in methods, consider using supplementary material for some of the real specific detail, which may be of interest only to a subgroup of readers. However, at that level, that's the sort of thing you probably might want to negotiate direct with the editor, because that will clearly vary from journal to journal. But if in doubt, put it into the manuscript. It may be that it's suggested that some of it comes out. Some key things to bear in mind when it comes to writing the results, but probably this is my biggest bugbear. Don't duplicate data in text, figures, and tables. If you've put it in a table, then you don't need to repeat it all in the text. If it's in a figure, then you don't need it in a table. And try to avoid repeating information in the methods. So what do I mean by that? Well, a good example would be to say the Mann-Whitney U test showed that there was no difference between the this and that, given blah-de-blah-de-blah, where it perhaps might be more appropriate to say the heart rates weren't different between those two groups. You don't need to remind the reader that you used the Mann-Whitney U test, because it's probably only 2 or 3 lines above that. Rob's covered these points about showing the size and direction of effects. Some journals have specific requirements, so look at the author guidelines and see what they want. They may want flow charts. They may specify which particular details they want with models. They may specify how many decimal points you must put in your p-value, those sort of things. So have a look at the author guidelines. And again, consider using supplementary material for the large tables. I hate those massive tables that are case 1, 5-year-old warm blood gelding presenting with whatever it was, and then you go right the way down to case 33. That's kind of raw data, and it's it's questionable how interesting that really is. It's better probably to try and summarize that. In the discussion, again, don't repeat the information that's already been given in the methods and the results. Start off by stating your main findings and discuss what you think they mean in the context of information that's already available in the literature and explanations for the observations you may have made in the context of literature that's previously been published. Very important to explain the limitations and sources of biases. If you don't do that, then the reviewers will be very happy to point them out to you. And finally, summarize your main conclusions. State how you think your work will help other clinicians and scientists. But avoid the temptation to sort of over-egg the cake, you know. It's very unlikely that you have discovered something that is going to be absolutely revolutionary. So be modest in the impact of the research that you or the particular, be modest about what you're claiming for your particular study. When it comes to figures and tables, again, read the author guidelines. There will be details in there about whether you're allowed to use colour. Most journals like colour these days, particularly in things like graphs, because it's often easier to see the difference between columns and so forth. Not every journal does. The sort of historical preference for black and white and greys was because it used to be that colour publishing was more expensive. In the modern world, it's no more expensive to publish in colour. But all that detail will be in the author guidelines. How many figures are you allowed and so forth. So legends should be comprehensible to a reader who hasn't read the text. That's quite an important point. I think authors sometimes forget that no one actually reads their paper. You're lucky if they read the title. You're quite fortunate if they read the abstract. If they go on beyond that, that's relatively unusual. But one of the things that perhaps will draw someone into your paper as they're flicking through it is they look at the figure, they like to read, understand, the legend should be sufficiently detailed that they can understand what you're doing, and that may draw them into reading the whole paper. What's the difference between tables and figures? Well, tables are there to present data, usually in a summary form, whereas figures are really about highlighting results, or sometimes to clarify the methods. So you want to choose the figures and tables carefully. I think a good example is imaging paper. Imaging people seem to find it extremely difficult to pick the best example, so they solve that by giving us 8. You know, you really do have to try and be selective and consider using supplemental information. I've already slagged off imagers, so I'll carry on. I really don't understand why they don't like videos. So if when you're looking at a CT scan, you look at it on the computer and you scan back and forth in Osiris or whatever it is. If you submit a video, you can have the same sort of effect. Someone can download that and skim through it frame by frame. So that's much more true life than looking at it on a printed image, or you can be a little bit more imaginative about it, but it really doesn't take much effort to make this sort of video, and so certainly for our diagnostic imaging, video is an attractive option, and of course that can go online. Moving on now to the abstracts and summaries. Guess what? Check the author guidelines. Many journals may require structured summaries, but not every journal. So make sure you're sending the right format to the right journal. You'll often see written, I don't know that this is necessarily true, but if you send it in the wrong format, then the assumption from the editor is, they look at the format and think, oh, that looks like it might have gone to JVIM. Oh, well, JVIM obviously didn't like it. We're not having it either. You know, so if you're in the wrong format, then that's a bit of a clue that you might have been elsewhere. But the abstract, as I've just said, is the bit that's the most frequently read part. This is, of course, the free part. And don't forget that along with the title and keywords, this is the bit that search engines are using too. So if you want people to read your work, put a lot of effort into the summary. I've mentioned already to include the important results. Don't just say, as Rob points out, there was a difference, or there was a difference, there wasn't a difference. You want to know some indication of the effect size. I was going to say something else, but it's gone out of my head. Supplementary material I've talked about already. Guess what? Check the author guidelines. But supplementary material, particularly when it comes to adding additional diagnostic imaging videos. We got some great videos in EVJ recently, which are horses with all sorts of variations on string halt and shivering and so forth. You can't present that in a static picture. So use the tools available. Comment or two about what to do when the reviews come back asking for revisions. Try not to get defensive. Best thing, certainly what I always used to do, because you may or may not know I have a bit of a short temper, I would just kind of, rubbish! But just put it aside. Don't send a letter to the editor immediately. I'm bored with getting them. Put it aside. Think about it. It's obvious because we know how quick. I send you an email, I get one back very quickly. It's quite funny, really. Try to think about it. Put it aside. Open it up a week later. Don't open it up a year later. That's another one that I do. That's not very good. Try to remember the reviewers are trying to help you. Also, choose your battles carefully. If they've come up with, say, 6 main points that they want you to address, and one of them is really important to you, give way on some of the points. So do most of the things that they ask, and if there's something that you think they've got wrong, then set that out in a rebuttal, preferably with some evidence to support your position. Don't underestimate the general comments. I think sometimes people come back, well, I can't, they weren't really critical. Often those general statements at the beginning, which may be very politely put, actually are where the real criticism is. So people seem to expect that they're going to get a line-by-line points, and if there aren't very many of them, that means their paper was quite good. Actually, those individual, line 121, you've used spelt and wrong, that's copy editing. It's the general comments that are more important. And one final point about revisions, which is a common problem. When you change things, maybe you're asked to put additional data in or take bits out. Don't forget to go back and revise your summary when you make a revision of your paper. Your papers are never going to be rejected. You'll be fine. So I'm just going to summarize by saying the main points. Write for your target reader. You're not writing for the reviewers. You're certainly not writing for the editor. Write for the person you want to read the paper. Keep it simple. Keep it short. Don't overstate your case. Assume that your reader is essentially reasonably knowledgeable. So don't start trying to teach grannies to suck eggs or whatever. Read the author guidelines. Try to step out of your research and write about it so that somebody else could replicate it. Get input from your colleagues and be prepared it's a reiterative process. Be prepared to revise and revise again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. René van Wieren, who's going to speak about the CARES statement.
Thank you. Yes, is that? Well, it's me giving the talk. It's basically on behalf of Paul Morley, who's not here, and Ken Hinchcliff, who is here. I don't know whether he's in the audience, but they were taking the initiative for the care statement. I'll come back to that later. Well, the famous declaration slide we can see. Okay, what's it all about? It's all about, I think, evidence-based veterinary medicine, which is basically the same as evidence-based medicine. Looking at here, in this case, basically the reporting thing. But of course, if you want to report well, then the first parts have to be okay also. And that's basically where it's all about. The CARE statement, I'll explain the name later, is how to set up a good study. This is all about randomized clinical trials. And where's the start? That's another acronym. That's a consort initiative that was taken in the 90s. And that was done because in medical research they felt that many studies were of limited value because of the methodology was quite poorly designed. And they said we have to make some standards for that. And so people got together and to improve the standards of clinical trials. And that resulted in, as I said, what is called the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. The idea is you first have a name, and then you find out, you first have an acronym, and then you find out how to fit in the words. And you see that with other acronyms too. But basically, what does it mean? There is a checklist you have to look at, preferably not before writing your paper, but before doing your research. A flow diagram, that's mandatory in the reporting of clinical trials. We have not that mandatory in EVJ yet, but I think that will come. Then there is the statement itself, and then there is a quite big explanation and elaboration document explaining how it works. You can find it here on the net. Just to give an example, where is the checklist about? Well, it just follows the standard layout of a paper, and it goes item-wise through all the items. Just to give a few examples, take the title here, identification as a randomized clinical trial in the title. That's important. Already people know, as it was stated, search engines use titles for finding papers. You should already say in the title what it's all about. Well, some points raised by Celia already in the preceding talk is what should be in the introduction. The methodological session is, of course, very important. Well, there's a whole checklist, but I won't go through it all now, but you can find it on the web. Just what are the criteria for a good study? And then if the study is okay, you can report it in the right way. And then go on to results and so on. Good. Here is an example of flow diagram. I don't think we have published many of them yet in EVJ, but I think we will be doing, hopefully. Where it becomes very clear from the enrollment phase here, all the exclusion criteria, the randomization, very well detailed, and then along the line how the numbers evolve. Explaining for every single subject, what did it do, why was it excluded, and so on. As I said, there are a couple of documents. I already showed the flow diagram and the checklist. The content statement itself, the original statement I think is from 1996. There was an update in 2001. There's now an update in 2010. Explaining basically the checklist, and then you have the explanation and elaboration document, what gives a couple of examples. For instance, here, if you have a text like this, that here we test the hypothesis the policy of active management of non-repairers labor would reduce the rate of cesarean section. Of course, it's a human example. Reduce the rate of prolonged labor and not influence maternal satisfaction with the birth experience. So that is, here we have the hypothesis Rob was talking about. And then the explanation is, objectives are the questions that the trial was designed to answer. Hypotheses are pre-specified questions being tested, and here we have the statistical testing we talked about, to help meet the objectives. And here, as they say also, they are amenable to explicit statistical evaluation. So stating very clearly what is your aims, what is your objective, what are your hypotheses, and then later you go into detail about how you to test it. So how far is CONSORT today? Well, that's now endorsed by over 50% of the core medical journals. And among these, the most prestigious ones, including New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, British Medical Journal, JAMA, and so on. That's CONSORT. But that's, of course, for human medicine. But the basis is the same. Randomized clinical trials in veterinary and human medicine basically is the same, but there are differences between human and veterinary medicine. There are a couple of journals endorsing the same statement, including EVJ, but there are specific requirements also for the veterinary field. And that was already taken up by a group looking, producing the so-called reflect statement, again a very nice acronym with this explanation here, and that was specifically aimed at farm animals. Of course, in contrast to human medicine, farm animals tend to be kept and managed in groups, And, well, the management is a bit different than most humans, at least. So there are a couple of methodological items that need to be addressed here. So these are very tailored to farm animal health with all the items addressing the way we keep livestock. Of course, that does not apply in most cases for individually kept animals like cats, dogs, and horses. But reflect is already in the air. And then came, because there was a lack of a kind of statement for these companion animals, and there came the CARES initiative trying to create a same kind of statement with checklists and so on for the animals we used to work with. Lead organizer was Paul Morley, who was from Colorado State University, and Ken Hinchcliff, who's from Melbourne, Australia, and also editor-in-chief of JVIM. They identified a sponsor, and they found it in the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. They then recruited 3 additional organizers, 2 of whom were experienced in Reflect, identified potential other participants based on demographics, specialization, and so on. I'll come to that later. Then, and also on the budget, of course, they selected 15 and took 2 students to take notes. And then they compiled a group of 22 people with different interests in species, small animals, equine, and equine order, in RCTs, editors, non-editors, clinical expertise, medical specialization, surgical, and so on, epidemiologists or not, and then these kinds of specializations. This was the group, some of whom are here. Anthony Blixhager is here, of course, Ken Hinchcliff here, and myself, and Mair, and myself, and Eric is here. And these were the 2 students. And here you see the group, you can see we had a very hard time in Colorado there, working very hard. And we worked on making a new checklist. The only thing is that CARES won't be CARES, because in the meantime, the CARE guideline have been published, which is the guideline for case reports, of course, for human medicine. So that means we're now looking for a nice other acronym that we have to find an explanation for. Good, but that's a minor issue. Yeah. We're still calling it CARES, and it will be published within not a long time. Looking at the CARES checklist, we have 29 items with sub-items. Well, going again through the normal set of a paper, including 6 on transparency. Yeah, then we're coming to disclosure and things like that. Also the ethical parts of it. And more into detail. For instance, the method section is quite important. Design, subjects, randomization, intervention, outcomes, euthanasia, if applicable, of course, sample size. All these items have to be addressed somehow in such a study. Same for results, the flow of participants, recruitment outcomes, all items have to be addressed. And if you look critically at many publications that have been published in veterinary literature, including in human literature, most of them will not have everything included. Discussion, and then we go to the limitations. Celia already told about it. And then we go to other info, and then we have things like fundings, conflicts of interest, ethical improvement. Here also we should have, it's not listed here, but we also should own an informed consent item. So that all has to be addressed. There is but it is it's still a draft, so it's not for distribution. But there is already a CARES checklist has been drafted. It is now being revised, so this is not the final one, but it will look like this one, very much like the consortium statement, but then applicable to the species we're dealing with. And this case, these are horses, dogs and cats, or even reptiles or snakes or whatever. Those animals that are kept in an individual way. I think that would be a better description. Okay, what is the scope of CARES? Well, as I said, it pertains to randomized controlled trials, evaluating the effect of intervention using natural or induced disease, so it's also for experimental. not for models, but experimental induced disorders. Yeah, conducted in the companion animal species with the target for the application of new interventions. So not when the animal is used as a model for, let's say, human medicine, but it should be the target animal. And the outcome should be related to health or performance. We have been writing it for dogs, cats, and horses, but of course it may apply to many other species. There are some special veterinary-specific veterinary items, unlike consort. For instance, what you would not really do, I think, in the human population, when it was experimental induced or occurring, you will not have very many human studies with experimental induced disorders. Imported are items like owners, caregiver facilities, which is different in human medicine. We not only deal with the animals, our patients, but also with the owners. Items related to euthanasia, those are all things different to human medicine. Where are we at this moment? Well, the intended timeline for CARES is to get back to the consensus group by this fall, and with the draft documents, the statement itself and the explanation and elaboration document, so it will be like consort, are in decent form but need some editing. And the idea is to be published in the new year, which is 2015, in various relevant journals, including GVM and EVJ. So that's going. Thanks for your attention. And keeping in time.
Okay, thank you very much. Our last speaker in this session is Dr. Chris Lamb, who's going to talk to us about how many papers are accepted.
Good afternoon, everybody. This presentation is a little bit different to the previous ones because I'm really presenting the results of a specific study, and I've no particular affiliations to admit to, but I will acknowledge Sally Burton, librarian at the RVC, and Chris Adams, who is one of our recent graduates who helped me do this study. So how many papers are accepted? Basically, this study calculated the acceptance rate for a variety of veterinary journals, and as you can imagine, the acceptance rate is a simple calculation. It's the number of manuscripts accepted by the journal out of the total number of manuscripts submitted to the journal within a period of time, and we're talking about calendar years here. Interestingly, this figure is not widely publicized. There are one or two journals who mention it on their website. So, for example, the Veterinary Record mentioned that their acceptance rate is 33%. And then a few other journals routinely have an article in their December issue, which is a review of the activity over the year. And they may also talk about the number of manuscripts accepted and the acceptance rate. But given that the majority of veterinary journals don't seem to make public this figure, I, with my colleagues, did a survey. And what we did was we basically collected up all the journals listed in the ISI Web of Science under the subject category Veterinary Sciences. And we looked at the editorial statements of those journals and identified those that peer-reviewed manuscripts. That was 126. We then tried to identify an email contact for them, and we were able to get an active email contact for 118. So the results I'm going to present are for those 118 journals. We got data back from 30 of the editors of these journals, which 26% is quite a modest return. But actually, given the method here, which is along the lines of a self-reported questionnaire, it's typical. The advantage is you can get this thing out there to a lot of people. It's rather easy to administer. The disadvantage is that they don't all pay much attention to it. A few editors actually told us that they were unwilling to participate. because they didn't think it was very useful or they wanted to keep their numbers to themselves. Most simply failed to reply. What we did was we compared the 30 journals that responded with those that didn't, just to see if our sample was representative of them all. And what we found was that the responding journals tended to have a higher number of citations per year and to publish more articles per year than the non-responding journals, but there was no significant difference in their impact factor. And here we are, the bottom line. The average acceptance rate for these 30 veterinary journals in 2012 was 47%. I haven't looked deeply into the literature for other similar surveys, but a relatively recent one of radiology journals, which was of interest to me, found an average acceptance rate of 52%. So our result is kind of in line with that. And I find this rather surprising that only half of the manuscripts that are submitted are accepted for publication. I would have thought it'd be higher than that. But anyway, it's about half. These are the journals that contributed to this study, and we certainly don't need to read them all, but it should be evident to you when you look at this list that it's quite a heterogeneous group. There are subject-specific journals, there are species-specific journals, there are some national or international journals, and there are one or two journals that we could think of as more general in their scope, such as the veterinary record near the top of the list there. So it's quite a heterogeneous group, and for that reason, it's not really worthwhile to dig into the differences between these journals. But for this group, many of you will be interested, Celia might be interested in the numbers, although she knew them already, for the Equine Veterinary Journal and Equine Veterinary Education, and you can see that the EVJ publishes quite a large number of papers every year. It's got a very healthy impact factor, and the acceptance rate was 43%. Equine Veterinary Education doesn't produce as many papers, has a lower impact factor and a higher acceptance rate. And you can see the average of the 30 responding journals on the right column there. So you can see that EVJ is one side of the average and Equine Veterinary Education is the other side of the average. We played around with the numbers a bit. We were interested in, was there an association, a correlation between the acceptance rate and the number of citations that a journal received or the number of papers that were published annually. I mean, one imagines that the higher the number of citations and the higher number of papers annually would be in some way representative of the importance or the authority of that journal. And we also looked at the association with acceptance rate and impact factor. And basically, the correlations are weakly inverse. So, for example, I've illustrated the impact factor on the graph, and you can see there's a fair old scatter with only a relatively vague trend, which was significant, but a relatively vague trend towards lower acceptance rates for higher impact factor journals. The acceptance rate is more strongly inversely correlated with the number of manuscripts submitted to a journal within a year. And perhaps that makes more sense because most journals are neither growing nor contracting. And so if they receive a greater number of articles, manuscripts for consideration, then to avoid prolonging the time between acceptance and publication, it may be natural for the editors to reject a few more to kind of control that process. That's what might be deduced from this. This diagram basically summarizes the fate of the manuscripts that are submitted to journals. You can see that the top row is the decision that was administered at the first submission of the manuscript. So the first reply that the author got from the journal, apart from thank you for submitting your manuscript, would have been along these lines. And you can see that a small proportion were accepted, a very small proportion were withdrawn by authors who presumably spotted some flaw, and 40% were rejected outright. And then for those that had minor or major revisions requested, then there's another level of outcome. And you can see that all of those for which minor revisions were requested, on average, were ultimately accepted. And the majority of those for which major revisions were requested were also accepted, although there were a few more rejected. And then there's a few pending. You know, the reason why this is a little bit retrospective is that manuscripts submitted in 2012 don't all reach decisions in 2012. Naturally, they bleed into 2013, and actually some of them bled into 2014. So there's still a small proportion uncertain. So that's where the acceptance rate of 47% comes from. It's the 3% accepted outright, and then the 44% accepted after revision. Again, I think it's noteworthy that the principal route, the most popular route through this table is straight to rejection. I still find that surprising. And then the second most popular route is via major revision to acceptance. Okay, so it goes without saying that the acceptance rate depends on things that we don't really have access to. You know, we didn't look in this study at the quality of manuscripts. I'm not sure how we would measure that anyway. And of course, the other side of the coin is the quality of manuscript reviews. You know, it's inevitable that a few manuscripts that should have been rejected are accepted and appear with errors. It's also well known that many manuscripts that are rejected by one journal are subsequently accepted by another. And so there's a big grey area here around, you know, other factors that affect acceptance rate. Celia mentioned when she was speaking about ethics that getting ethical approval, apart from being viewed as a hurdle, should also be reviewed as a way of potentially improving the quality of research. And this is the same kind of take-home message about the peer review process. It is a hurdle, but a good review should outline to authors in what ways they could improve their manuscript. Again, one of the things I would conclude out of this study is that in the majority of cases, when revisions are requested by reviewers, authors are mainly able to correct those flaws. And so, you know, that is one of the positive aspects of having this peer review process. Okay, so that's what I want to present. I'd be happy to take any questions, although I imagine we're going to have a group question session, are we?
Yes, I think we might ask all of the speakers to come forward. We might need another chair up here, and we will have questions.
They're all tied together, those chairs. Oh, Renee's managed to break it. How much time have we got?
Loads.
Oh, good.
Like 10 minutes.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Oh, there's just...
Good one here.
We've all got chairs.
Good one.
Okay. Then I believe we have stewards with microphones. If anyone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you to ask. This is your chance. Okay. Excellent.
Hi, Ken Hinchcliff. Thanks. That was really good. Celia, I just had one comment about authorship, and it's public because we published the retraction. We recently had last year had a paper retracted after it was published for scientific misconduct. Every author on that paper suffered the consequences of the retraction. So I think our guidelines now for authorship is that authors take responsibility for the whole paper, every author. You can't say, I just did the statistics, so therefore I'm not responsible for the fact that something else was done. And that's a philosophical approach that we've taken. But it came home to roost very clearly to me when we had to deal with, you know, the 6 authors on the paper who were suffering the consequences for some things that happened that they might not have all known about. So that's a comment rather than a question.
Yeah, the one thing I didn't have time to talk about was that bit I put in the box about the guarantor. That's a kind of direct quote from the International Journal of Medical Editors. In human medicine, they'll often expect one person to be the guarantor. It would be, say, the head of the department or the study group leader or whatever, which is something I think perhaps we should maybe think about that. But based on what you've just said, you would probably advise against that, would you?
I mean, the guarantor has to be sure that actually what they're guaranteeing is that they can guarantee what they say they are. I think what happens is we can't parcel out responsibility among the authors. If your name's on the paper, you're responsible for it.
Yes, exactly.
And because you really well identified a number of situations where often there appear to be authors on there who might not have contributed. But you get the credit, but there's some jeopardy that goes along with it.
Exactly. Stephen's going to, sorry.
Yes, I do have a question later on, but I'd like to follow on from this one because fantastic session. Can I say I think this is a really timely and really good session, and thank you very much to everybody who's spoken because it's so important, this area. It is a developing area, so a couple of weeks ago I was in Milan at a big medical education conference, 2,600 attendees, and there was a huge session on ethics of publication in medical education research in the big impact journals, including British Medical Journal, which is a major channel for medical education as well as clinical publications. And one of the things there was this subject of authorship and who was responsible. And Ken's position, which I was sort of advocating there, because I stood up and spoke about this, I was accused of being idealistic, and coming back to your sorts of positions, Celia, in some of those broader, more mainstream journals, there is this rather more restricted view of responsibility. But having said that, they recognise they are extremely vulnerable, particularly when they have to do a withdrawal. So if we can maintain Ken's position, which I think is the ethical position, that is a really good thing for our community to do. But as I say, I was accused of being idealistic when I was promoting that.
Well, maybe we live in a smaller world and therefore it's not so idealistic.
It also extended then into an issue with those journals where there were individuals confessing to citing literature as though they'd read the papers when all they'd done was read the abstracts. And again, I challenged them over that because one of the things I pick up then is individuals citing papers as though this is the original source of the comment there, when I as a reviewer know that the attribution should go further back. And we have an issue which I think is really sad in modern scientific literature around the implication that so many things have been discovered in the last 5 or 10 years, and we haven't properly recognised the historical figures in our community who actually contributed those original observations. So I think there's a whole area here in terms of scientific integrity and honesty, including the correct author identity and recognition of responsibilities that we all need to try and uphold if we're going to fulfill our role as scientists in the difficult modern world.
Yeah, on that point, I received a paper the other day which made me reflect. I remember reading a very similar study and finding it new and exciting when I was an intern. So what that told me is the loop has finally gone right round. So the authors who had written this paper clearly were not old enough to remember the days when I was an intern.
Yes. Perhaps they weren't born.
I used to look up to you, Chris. You were quite grown up when I was an intern.
We have a question down front here.
Sorry, I had a question on the same, on the authorship that you brought up at the beginning, Celia. Who is classed when you are writing an abstract or maybe writing a publication on behalf of somebody else's work, so it's not the original author's work, where are you who are the authors, and what order should they be in?
Well, it sort of depends. And the first thing, this is a problem, say, much more so in human pharmaceutical drug trial kind of work, where a drug company will sponsor a trial, and then they'll take the data, and one of their staff writers will write it, and that is, I think, rightly questioned and sort of ghost writers and so forth. That's something I have no experience of as far as I'm aware. That's not really going on in our community, but I don't think that's really the question you're asking. So let's say, well, let me give you an example actually from my own experience. I can remember starting a project with one resident, and that resident finished the program, didn't finish it, and then another resident comes along and adds it was more of a clinical retrospective, but over spanning sort of 2 residencies. It had imaging aspects and it had medicine aspects. So a medicine resident worked on the medicine aspects and they finally finished and didn't do it, and then an imaging resident worked on the imaging aspects and finally wrote it up. So you could say that imaging resident was using work that they hadn't done. Is that kind of the scenario you're talking about?
Clinical research has been done. So,
how about if it's a
where
student?
Clinical research has been done by an author, but they're not either got time or expertise, because it is actually quite an art to write abstracts for reviews or even clinical to put into journals. And if somebody else is actually doing the writing, bringing together, it's not actually changing any of the data, doing it, it's more bringing it together. Are they then classified as an author, or are they just a body that is doing the work and then the authors are as the originals?
No. So, and I'm hoping that Ken will help me out here, but the both parties, whether it's the person actually doing the work or the person looking at the study results and discussing them, collating them, whatever, both of those people, those people are having an intellectual input. So they're both authors. And is there a precedent for order? Actually, the real answer is that within your group, you have to decide yourselves. So you're both authors. There is an option, and this is going back to my medicine and imaging residence, there is an option which is rarely used, that you can have joint first authorship. So frequently, that would be the sort of most appropriate way. So some person has collected a bunch of data, another person has done equal amount of work collating and analysing that data, then you could say they are equal. And you can publish as joint authors. It's usually a little asterisk, and it says something in the footnote saying Dr. X and Dr. Y took equal responsibility. And actually, if you really want to get technical, usually when those people put it on their own CV, they'll flip them around so that it goes X, Y, Y, and that's all fine. But the real answer is that level of decision has to be worked out within your group, and with the advice of your mentors and supervisors and so forth, and go to more experienced colleagues within your department if you want to. An editor can't really help you about that. What we're interested in is knowing that every author on that list has made an intellectual contribution, but who goes first and who goes second and so forth, probably best decided by the group themselves. Would you guys go along with that?
No, I'm saying for my work as let's say research leader of a research group, my statement is always, well, the guy is who writes the paper is the first author. Quite simple. There's sometimes the shared authorship in very exceptional cases, but.
Well, you're implying that the work is all the data collection, and this writing thing is some minor trivia. That's surely not the case.
You can ethically put that into yourself. So
no,
that you can ethically, you are correct in being the first author because you have been the person putting the publication together.
But no, well, in most cases, the first author will be the same person having done the work. But in exceptional cases, it may indeed be that that's not the case. But it's then a bit dependent on the amount of work done, because a publication is more than only the practical work. You can do the practical work, but there's also data analysis. There is also interpretation of data. And then there's the writing of it. So that's all need to be done. And not necessarily the one is more important than the other.
We as editors would rarely quibble with the order in which authors appear. That's kind of for you. What we would quibble with is we might ask you to reconsider whether all people really deserve to be on the paper. The one thing we can never know is that have you missed someone off? Because we don't know about that person. And that is equally unethical.
Richard Piercy, Royal Veterinary College. Celia, I was struck by the comments you said about ethical review for practitioners in particular, and as somebody who's spent time in university and practiced yourself, I wondered whether you could elaborate a little bit. In particular, I commonly will read studies that have been published by practitioners, often very good studies, but I'm aware that sometimes if those studies had gone to ethical review within an institution, they would very often have been, the study would very often have either been changed or would have been classified as being done in the UK under the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, as opposed to under the Veterinary Surgeons Act, which is how it was accomplished in practice. So can you elaborate on what we can do about this? Because I think it's different for
and I might
the two
call
groups.
on Professor May to help me on this. Most of those kind of turquoisey slides that I was using were direct lifts from the Royal College BSAVA Working Party, and I did take the trouble to ask the Royal RCVS President last night, are these rules or recommendations or advice? What are they? And the answer is it's advice, and until it's kind of tested by somebody being hauled up in front of the disciplinary committee, that it will remain at the advice level. So the RCVS's position, actually the one slide I took out, which perhaps I should have left in, is that pathway through from is it research, is it home office research versus clinical research. That applies to everyone, not just institutes. So you're absolutely right, you do occasionally see people making mistakes, but the RCVS, if someone does experimental research without a home office license, I believe anyway, Stephen can tell me if I'm wrong, I believe that would be a disciplinary matter, would it not? So it's not so much ethical as professional standards. What else? Does that answer your question?
Well, I was also interested in your suggestion that there may be a body that is
yeah,
formed.
again, that comes straight from the RCVS, and I obviously have some reservations about it. Since you've pointed out I come from private practice environment, we're very fortunate that the Animal Health Trust is right nearby. So the AHT, they might not after this, but they will help local practices and also some other practices. They don't have to be geographically local. So they're making their ethical review committee open to others. There is a payment for that, which is I've suddenly found myself on that committee. But what are the options the RCVS are suggesting? And very much kind of echoing what I said, I think the best option is for people to in practice to consider collaborative endeavour with people within institutes, and then they may get statistical advice, study design. Research is no longer a one-man effort. So there may be ways that they can join with friends and colleagues in the institutes and use that route. The RCVS point number 4 was you could set up your own ethics committee. I can't imagine what an ethics committee within Rossdale's might look like, but I'm not overly keen on that idea. I think if the benefits of the review process are, as I outlined, getting some independent advice is always going to be helpful. So I think going outside rather than inside would be good. And the RCVS did hint that they might at some point in the future start down that route themselves. And they might. I'm not in those circles, so I don't know. Stephen might want to expand, but to my mind, the best solution for individuals in practice is to probably try to join forces with the institutes that are engaged in clinical research, and certainly for the AHT, they will. You don't have to be working with one of their staff members. They will look at the projects, and I've no idea what's going on in other institutes and whether that's an option. But I would certainly encourage the veterinary schools in the UK to make that available to people in practice, because I do think that would be a really positive benefit and get practice research going. We all recognise the value of practice-based research, and that's one way the institutes could help that process. Can you clarify any of the RCVS stuff, Stephen? I don't know why I'm picking on you, but you just look like the sort of man would know.
I can. I wasn't on the group that Sandy Trees chaired the group, and I think it was a really good initiative in terms of that report and advice. But I think certainly the RCVS very much regards that as a first edition. And, as I pointed out yesterday, we are we are the veterinary profession, and everybody here who has views on that and where we should be going does need to feed back in terms of the second edition, because it's seen as an evolving area in terms of bringing, certainly as far as the UK is concerned, a greater clarity to the harms that we do to animals in their interests, and therefore come under the Veterinary Surgeons Act if you view treatment as a necessary harm to improve the animals, thinking in terms of a justice framework, versus the harms we do to animals that are not necessarily in their interests. They may be interested in their interest of animals in their group, or they may even be in the interests of other animals or other species. And so there's this spectrum and grey area in terms of what's covered by the Animal Scientific Procedures legislation and the Veterinary Surgeons Act. And that's what this is attempting to do, bring clarity to that, and then allow individuals to see how they need to gain approval and recognition to be able to proceed with the investigations that they want to do. So it's not to stop individuals doing practice-based research. I think some of us would have liked the RCVS to take on some sort of umbrella role into ethical approval, but then the issue was around whether they were authorised to do that and whether they could spend money related to Veterinary Surgeons Act activities in that broader role of research. And so, like you're saying, Celia, I think the hope is on the part of the RCVS that the universities and other research institutes interested in animal research will rally round and try and offer help in terms of guidelines and being able to process through their own ethical review processes some studies on behalf of others. I think the point you made, for me, which is also one very much that is at the heart of some of the RCVS reasoning here, is that ethical review really contributes to the quality of studies. And it makes us think about what we're asking of those that contribute and what we're actually asking of animals if they're in the experience, but also all the human people involved in it. And you talked about qualitative type methods and questionnaires and things like that. Every time we ask somebody to take part in a questionnaire, we ask them to contribute their time, and there's a responsibility on us to be collecting those data in a meaningful way and ideally communicating those data, because that's part of the scientific process through publications and what have you. And I'm extremely concerned now, so this is slightly moving on to another topic, about the number of questionnaires I get emailed where it's unclear to me whether that's got ethical approval, it's unclear to me whether the study is valid, and it's unclear to me whether it's ever going to receive any communication in the future. And I've even heard people say things like, well, if it doesn't really reveal anything, we haven't lost anything. Well, an awful lot of people, if they responded, have lost some of their time and been let down by those people. Yeah. So again, as a community, it's really important that we up the standards so that we discharge our responsibility to all participants, animals and humans, in research studies.
And I would entirely agree with everything you just said, but just to, again, want to, I guess, emphasise the point that certainly from the EVJ perspective, owner-informed consent essential, whereas ethical review, we don't want people to get tangled up and just if they've done a great study that's been really useful, they've got informed consent, but because through whatever reason, lack of access or whatever, they haven't got that stamp and the code number from an ethical review committee, then that is not going to be a hurdle. But owner-informed consent, we can all get that.
I'm just wondering, as vets, being a member of a professional body, can you get struck off for things like scientific misconduct? Whereas people who are just, well, I don't mean just scientists, but people who aren't a member of a body don't have as much to lose apart from to be told they don't want papers submitted again, I guess.
Actually, yes is the answer, and that's the whole point. Now the RCVS has produced a comprehensive document of advice. It sort of stays advice until it gets tested at the disciplinary committee level. Is that correct, Stephen? That's how I understand it. And just to bring it back to a slightly more international flavour, obviously the rules are subtly different and so forth, but I think, we published, or Joe Bertone wrote an editorial in EVJ, when was it? Early 2013, essentially making the same case of, pointing out that practice research is important, but collaboration is also important. Get advice, speak to people like Rob. They have people like you there. They do. So for all the, it's not just about, getting a rubber stamp. Your research will be better if it's planned ahead of time.
I was just asking out of curiosity. It won't be the scientific paper that gets me struck off.
Just say in relation to disciplinary processes, obviously it's confidential, the sorts of things that go through, but certainly plagiarism has been referred to the RCVS, and people have had severe warnings in relation to plagiarism. The one particular case that I know most about there, in fact, there was a decision in the end, it was very grey, that possibly there was some naivety around there, which was the reason why it didn't go further. But as we move on in terms of understanding of ethical conduct in science, then it becomes more and more serious when you commit an error. In relation to specialist registration, there is a European college that's currently involved in looking at whether somebody will have their diploma removed because of ethical misconduct. In relation to scientific publishing. So these things are getting more and more serious as society is viewing them more seriously, and we've seen the examples from other areas. I mentioned to you yesterday, society moves on in terms of what it expects in terms of professional conduct, and around the area of us misbehaving and undermining our profession, society is becoming much more judgmental, and therefore organisations such as the RCVS and other associations or statutory bodies elsewhere are going to take this more seriously in terms of the reputation of the profession as we go forwards.
Yeah, the days that doctor knew best are long since gone, eh?
Okay, and on that optimistic note, I think we will conclude this session. I encourage all of you, this has been wonderful discussion, to follow up with the next session on Ask the Editor, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more exciting things to come.